Is there a connection between Richard Allen's visit to a conservation officer the day after Abby and Libby were murdered and the unspent shell found at the murder scene? I'm going to conclude this video with something very speculative that you haven't seen anywhere before. First, are we sure Richard Allen is guilty? Yes. There might still be questions about whether others were involved, perhaps someone setting up Allen with the girls, but there's no serious question he was the killer. The day after the deaths of Abby and Libby, Richard Allen went to a conservation officer to tell him he'd been on the trail that day. At the trail entrance, he encountered 3 teenage girls. He described them accurately, and later, they described him. At 10 minutes to 2, he was on the bridge looking around when a young woman arrived and, seeing him, turned around. He accurately described this woman, and she described him. The woman passed Abby and Libby a few minutes later as they were heading towards the bridge. So this puts Richard Allen, both in his own words and in the words of the witness, at the bridge moments before Abby and Libby arrived. Yet he claims he never saw them, which is impossible. Does that by itself prove he's the killer? No, but any reasonable person looking at that says, yeah, this is the guy. But there's more evidence, enough to put it over the top. Allen was wearing the same clothing seen on Bridge Guy and Libby's video. Also, the only way back to his car was the trail, but he saw no one else after the young woman at the bridge, and no one else has come forward to say they saw him. So how did he get back to his car? Well, to get back, after going over the bridge, he had to cross the creek. A man in his description was seen by another witness who was driving a couple of hours later, saw him walking along the road, muddy and bloody. The defense team will also have to explain why he actually confessed to the killings over the prison phone to both his mother and then his wife. Finally, there's the unspent bullet shell found at the scene. Let's go back to the conservation officer that Allen met with the day after the murders. Word is Allen reached out to someone he knew in law enforcement to say he was at the trail that day. It was then arranged for him to meet with an active conservation officer. You might wonder why they didn't send a regular cop, but this was a manpower issue. The murders in this isolated area created an all-hands-on-deck situation. A multi-agency task force was created. But the key question is why Richard Allen came forward on his own. Well, we have to remember that Allen worked at the photo counter at CVS. In a town of only 5,000, there aren't a lot of stores, so most people in the town would recognize his face. On the trail that day, Allen had been seen by the 3 teen girls and the young woman at the bridge, so he probably feared someone would come forward to say they saw the guy from CVS. So coming forward on his own, therefore, was an effort to make sure no suspicion came his way. But think about this. The only reason Allen was eventually identified is because he came forward on his own. It seems the file on him got lost in the shuffle. However, after the Keegan-Klein River search led nowhere, they finally went back to square one and discovered Allen had been there at the same time as the girls. So his effort to get ahead of the narrative is ultimately what undid it. The question is why he took the tremendous risk of coming forward in the first place. The only logical answer is because he thought it was likely he'd been recognized. He wouldn't take the risk unless he thought he had to, which leads to another question. Why did he ever think, to begin with, that he could go down that trail, commit murder, and not be recognized? He knew the trail was frequented by hikers. He knew he'd very likely be seen and recognized. He would have known that when he left the house. And he left home planning to kill. He had a pistol and a blade and who knows what else stuffed in that coat. Enough of his face was exposed that he figured he likely had been identified, and that's why he reported to the authorities the next day. So to me, a reasonable question is, what was the plan? If he knew he'd very likely be recognized, what did he think would happen? The way he did it, there was no way to craft an alibi. So what was the plan? In October of 2006, in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, a man backed up his pickup truck to an Amish schoolhouse as the kids were returning from recess. Entering the school, at first he asked the teacher if any of the students had turned in a certain object he'd lost. That was pretext. Moments later, he returned with a 9mm. The man, 32-year-old Charles Roberts, married and a father of 3, had left separate suicide notes to his wife and each child. He ordered the boys in the school to help him carry the items into the classroom from his truck while the teacher escaped and ran off to get help. When he saw the teacher run off, he knew his time was now limited and he wouldn't be able to fully execute his terrible plan, whatever it was. He freed the boys, as well as a pregnant woman and 3 mothers with small children, and barricaded himself with the girls. All of this gives us more clues into his mind that we'll analyze in a later episode. His supplies included a shotgun, a stun gun, wires, chains, a small bag, and a wooden board with multiple sets of metal eye hooks. Also in a bag, he had a change of clothes, toilet paper, candles, and flexible plastic ties. As police surrounded the school, he shot the 10 girls, killing 5 before shooting himself, right as police were trying to break in. So 2 things are clear. 1, he had not planned to survive. But 2, he did plan to have plenty of time to act out his fantasy, whatever that was. Clearly, he planned some kind of horrific, slow murder of the girls. Like other serial killers, he was acting on a fantasy he'd long developed in his mind, very likely since adolescence. That he never acted on it before is another clue. Was there a triggering event that pushed him to finally act on it? Yes, but you can't think of someone with a normal brain to understand it. At the school, he called his wife to say goodbye, telling her that what he planned was due to some slight that occurred 20 years ago. But in his suicide note to her, he mentions the tragic death of their first daughter several years before, how this had forever changed him. We'll do a much deeper look at this in a future video with Richard Allen in mind. We have to understand 2 things about the psychopathic brain. First, their minds are like accountants from hell. Every slight, every grievance, every wrong goes into the ledger of their mind and must eventually be balanced. There's no escaping it. If you have a few beers and insult your psychopathic neighbor, you can apologize every day. Bring him a case of beer, mow his lawn. It won't matter. That account will be balanced. It's a gear their minds can't turn off. What you hope is that this accountant from hell is hardwired to balance the books proportionally, because some psychopathic brains actually apply a penalty. So you insult your neighbor and he torches your car. An odd aspect to this account balancing is that time is irrelevant. He might wait 20 years to balance the books. Time doesn't matter to a psychopath. With the nickel mines killer, he probably did really remember that slight from 20 years before. But that explanation is inadequate since this involved sexual killing fantasies, and it involved a decision he knew would lead to his own destruction. Was there another trigger then? In the suicide letter to his wife, he referred to the death of their first daughter several years before. He attributed his depression to that. However, we need to understand that the psychopathic brain, short of stimulus, is very low in dopamine in its normal state. Stimulus, however, gives them a bump in dopamine 4 times that of a normal person. Unfortunately, stimulus can be harder to come by as time goes by because what stimulates today is less likely to stimulate tomorrow. Lacking stimulus, the psychopath becomes lethargic, down. Yet stimulus, where they can achieve it, as I said, gives them a bump in dopamine that's 4 times that of normal brain. So Charles Roberts had several things going on in his mind at the same time. The slight given him 20 years earlier created a box in the ledger that had to be balanced someday. The death of his baby daughter would be experienced in a similar way. God had taken something that belonged to him. This was an imbalance that had to be fixed. Meanwhile, his need for stimulus in his dopamine-lacking brain grew more severe every day. He satisfied that need for a time with murderous fantasies. The desire to act on those fantasies was held in check by his image of himself as a good husband and father, a good Christian. But the dam was about to break. And his twisted mind would get the dopamine fix it needed at the same time, balance the books for the slight given him long ago and more recently by God himself. I'll explain in a future video how perfectly this matches the Richard Allen situation, but for now, I want to point out that an ejected bullet shell was found at the murder scene in Delphi. Speculation has been that Richard Allen chambered a bullet in a dramatic movement meant to scare the girls, and this ejected the bullet that was already in the chamber. I'm arguing something different, that he actually ejected the bullet after their deaths when he tried to commit suicide and had a problem with his weapon. He went to that trail with killing intent and knew there was a very good chance he'd be recognized by someone on the trail, but he didn't worry about it because he didn't plan to survive the day.